You're listening to the Cash Flow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner, your source for investing made easy. Here's Andy Tanner.
Welcome to the Cash Flow Academy podcast. I'm Andy Tanner, and boy, do we have a episode in store for you. Big payoffs, lots of insight, and this is going to be a lot of fun most of all. And so I welcome you. This is where we do our very best to make investing simple and unravel some of the complexities out there. And I think my hope is that you'll have some actionable items at the end of this episode. And today we're going to talk a little bit about the past. We're going to talk a little bit about the present, a little bit about the future. And particularly the future's it's kind of a fun thing because the definition, you could argue that the defining characteristic of markets and really future would be its unpredictability. And yet as human beings wanting stability and security, we endlessly want to predict it. There's a lot of ways you can predict the future. For example, policy plus demographics can give you a picture of what the future might have. Trends can kind of show us, well, at least where we're pointed, it may change. But one of the things that I'll lean on sometimes is the idea that history repeats itself. And so today we have a marvelous author. We have Neil Howe, who has written a couple of books. The one he wrote in the late 90s that one of my mentors, Robert Kiyosaki, introduced me to is The Fourth Turning. And his new book is The Fourth Turning is Here. And so you can pick that up on Amazon. You can visit what he does at thefourthturning.com. But Neil Howe, thank you for taking some time with us to discuss this very important book that you've written.
Yeah, Andy, thank you. Delighted to be here.
This is going to be a lot of fun because we're going to cover a ton of ground. This book is tremendously observational. A lot of thought on different generations, a lot of thought on history. Let's start off a little bit with your background. I know you're co-author in the first book. I think he passed away, I want to say maybe about 10, 15 years ago, has it been? 2007, I think?
Yeah, I wrote a number of books with Bill Strauss, and he passed away in 2007. I think the first book I co-authored with him, and in fact, the first that sort of pioneered this whole way of thinking about the connection between generations, aging, and history, is a book we did called the Generations. And we wrote that in 1991. It's basically a generational history of America. I mean, if you ever want to hear, we were amazed that no one had done that before, told American history as a sequence of generational biographies. You know, it's kind of an obvious idea. No one had done it. We started with the first generation of, the old world, the Puritans who came to New England with the Great Migration in the 1630s as young people. And we followed all the way through 14 generations later to little kids when we were writing. These would be the millennials. And in fact, it was in that book when we dated the first millennial births to about 1982. We said they would be the first high school class of 2000. So we gave them the name millennial. So if you want to know where millennial comes from, it was in our book, 1991. And at that time, even Gen X had not been named yet. So Gen Xers, had to be like that, right? The generation that came after you was named before you were. I mean, any Gen Xer knew that it had to be like that,
Yeah.
But a couple of years later, Doug Coupland came out with his novel, Generation X, obviously giving the name to Xers. He was a British Columbian, born in 1961, but in our opinion, that's sort of the first cohort of Gen X. But that book was mainly interested in cycles and patterns of generational succession. We observed that certain generations, not only were generations very different, and generations were aware of the differences even back in the 17th century, but that certain kind of generations always followed other kinds of generations. You know what I mean? Like after you had a sort of a principled, idealistic generation that railed against the establishment of their parents and the rules of their parents, it was always followed by a cynical, pragmatic, materialist kind of Gen X like generation, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and the boomer Xer phenomenon, right? Xers coming after boomers is not the first time this happened. This has happened repeatedly in American history. For example, after the generation of Ralph Waldo Emerson and Abraham Lincoln and William Lloyd Garrison, I mean, all these people who were loud radicals and feminists and commune founders and so on in the 1830s, they were followed famously by the Gilded Generation. These are people like George Armstrong Custer and Ulysses Grant. I mean, these are guys that just got it done. They didn't say much. And a very different, they were a generation of metal and muscle, very different generational persona. They didn't think much of themselves, unlike Ralph Waldo Emerson, who just loved himself. This new generation didn't think much of themselves. We've seen that again and again and again. And similarly, following this very pragmatic generation, we typically have a moral panic around children, and suddenly they are in turn followed by a much more protected generation. So, millennials, right? They're special. We have baby on board signs for them, and we have special ways of buckling into this.
We're helicopter parents.
So, exactly. But this has been repeated again and again. Now, the one thing that we thought that was implicit in this, so if you have generations obviously shaped by history as children and coming of age, and then they in turn shape history, right? 30, 40 years later, as parents and leaders. That if you have a cycle of generations, it implies a cycle of history itself. And in fact, one great fascinating feature of American history that many of historians have noticed, that if you look at our great civic upheavals, these periods at which we transform public life, civic life, we rebuild the economy, politics, infrastructure, we reconstruct the outer world, right, of the public institutions we live in, that these periods and usually often periods of war, upheaval, revolution, so these occur about a long human lifetime apart. So, during the colonial era, the one period which is filled with the Glorious Revolution and King Philip's War and Bacon's Rebellion, and historians know about this, it's the last quarter of the 1600s, about 1675 to 1700. And then you go forward along human life, you come to the American Revolution, right? Then you go further along, you come to the Civil War. Then again, you come to the Great Depression, World War II. You do it again, here we are. You know what I mean? This is the period we now live in. And, history never feels like history when you're living in it. But we are living in it. And we are in what we call the fourth turning. This is this period when we remake the outer world. And roughly halfway in between these periods comes the great awakenings of American history, where we rebuild the inner world of culture, values, art, and it was very conveniently in American history. We actually numbered them. We talked about the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, the third Great Awakening. So, and many historians call the late 60s and 70s America's fourth or fifth Great Awakening. So you begin to see the overall outlines here of a pattern that is historical. It has to do with changing moods with generation-length eras, but it's associated with the aging of different generational types. So maybe that's sort of a good introduction, to all the books I wrote with Bill Strauss. Generations, The Fourth Turning, which came out in 1997, which really predicted that we would be moving into this era sometime around the middle of the 2000 to 2010 decade. That turned out to be actually the GFC, in 2008. And now I've come out with this new book because I had so many people asking me, where are we now? Where are we? Where are we? Are we in the fourth turning? How's it going to end?
Yeah.
And as you know, Andy, I explore a lot of that in the book.
Yes, it's a broad book, and it's really jam packed. And when I do a read, what I attempt to do, and it's impossible to do, so I beat my head against the wall, but I try to take all my opinions and I leave them at the door when I open the book and say, hey, what does this author have to say? And generally, I'm pretty good with being open to new stuff. This one, man, I was agreeing, like agree. And I was like, no. It was just a wonderful. It was an intellectually challenging book to read. And I first became interested in your work with one of my mentors, Robert Kiyosaki. In fact, we used to, with some of our advisors, we used to play the song from the Birds to every time there's a season turn, and we would actually start that meeting. It's like a church, like an opening song, because we would talk about this period. Now, my sons know that when I go to the Chinese restaurant, I never read my fortune cookie, because I have this disdain for superstition and Nostradamus. You can take Nostradamus and you can kind of play Texas bullseye with stuff. But I'll tell you what's interesting about your book is this is it didn't strike me as a metaphysical, prophecy book. It looked very, very scientific, very sociological, like this generation tends to act this way, which tends to influence the next generation to maybe rebel or think outside the box. It was very, struck me as more scientific than other people who are prognosticators in terms of the sociological science. And while different winters might have different extremes, maybe this is the worst winter and this is a mild winter, still winter, and the cycles still come. So I
am a demographer as well as an historian, and actually, that's my day job. I actually advise wealth managers, and I do so as a demographer. So I pay a lot of attention to demography. You said earlier, one way of looking
demographics
at it was policy plus demography. I look at demography, but one way I see generational aging is just a super layer of demography. You understand what I mean? It's
yes.
A particularly far-sighted. It's not so many demographers say, and they say this rightly, right? That we can tell a lot about the future because we actually can make pretty good predictions about population based on mortality, fertility, migration, morbidity, you know what I mean? All that stuff, we just crank it into a big engine. And the thing is that we actually can predict, the population of China, the population of the US, 20, 30 years out, because they've already been born. We can count them. You know what I mean? They're just aging forward. And there is a lot you can do with demography to predict the future. What we do is add this generational layer on top of it. We say, one thing that we can predict about the year 2040, and I think this is what people don't understand, 2040 is not going to be some sci-fi world. It's going to be all of us just older, and that insight, it just escapes people. And in other words, that the 30-year-olds will be today's 10-year-olds. They'll just be now age 30. What do we already know about, right? Do you see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
I think this is an insight. The generational aging, in other words, the 50-year-olds would be today's 30-year-olds. What do we know about them? What do we know? What people who are like them at age 30 in the past, what do they usually end up like at age 50?
Certainly.
This is what no one else does. I mean, no one else, and it sounds like a pretty simple insight, right? But this is the generational method. This is what we call the generational diagonal. That if you look at history, very often we look at history, we just look at it as a bunch of 55-year-old or 65-year-old men, doing things year after year after year. That's history. Or maybe people of all ages doing something in 1853, and then they're doing all these things in 1854. What I'm saying is, let's look at history in a different way. Let's look at history as the x-axis is time, the y-axis is age.
Yeah.
And then each of us lives a diagonal line. Think about that. You get a year older as every year goes by. Think of a generation as a series of diagonal lines. And think of a point in time as a vertical line through all those diagonals. So that a point in time like 1968 means something completely different depending on which diagonal you're at, because they had completely different experiences early on in life, right? What did 1968 mean to someone who was born in, I don't know, Bill Clinton's year, 1946?
Yeah.
About someone born 30 years earlier who was splashing ashore at D-Day. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It meant something
Well, they're
very, very different, right? So, but that's how we need to look at history. It's almost like a depth sounding through different cohorts who were shaped completely differently. This is how I would like to look at history. And I think it adds a whole new dimension because it actually allows you to make, to a degree, forecast. That's what I love about it.
It's interesting. My grandfather came from Germany. He was a kind of a gold bug, and he was part of that. Remember the Weimar Republic and that destruction of their currency. And if you'd asked my grandpa what season he was living in, he'd say it's winter. If you went to my father, who's a boomer, growing up in his household, it was winter every day, right? The world was coming to an end. Satan was taking control of the world. And, every generation sees themselves on the cusp of catastrophe because that's our nature defensively, right? So while every generation sees itself as exceptional, which is true, everyone is exceptional. I think this book you've written of saying the fourth turning is here is extreme. Like, I think people are more right if they say winter's here now than if you just looked at all the problems of the day in your day, say, world's coming to an end. And this is why I think it's fascinating from an economic standpoint. You talk, particularly, I cheated a little bit and skipped ahead. I wanted to read what you had to say on Generation X because that's me. I thought, what's my fate? So I did cheat a little bit and skip ahead, and then I went back and around. Couldn't resist. And it's interesting. There's a bit of a Barnum effect. You say, yeah, me. And we can stereotype a generation that, well, these guys are all snowflakes, and these guys are all, they're the silent. And Henry Tajfel talked about social identity theory, where we can kind of lose the personal. But I think in this realm, it's appropriate to do. We're looking at a massive world. We're looking at lots of different cultures and countries and generations. And I think it's wise. And I don't think we fall in too much of a trap in doing that. So let's talk about winter. Man, you make observations in the opening of this book of where we are, and it's just this barrage of observation, balkanization of our society, lots of things happening geopolitically in our society, all kinds of stuff. I won't ruin it. I'll let the reader read it. But what was your goal in talking about this massive change that's about to come? I mean, we have AI, we have currencies changing, we have politics changing. And the number one thing I see when we look at demographics and policies and put them together is I see the word unsustainable time and time and time and again. In other words, the path we're on right now is not one we can stay on, no matter what you believe about history. If you just took a snapshot today of what we know, things are going to change. So what was your goal for a reader? When someone reads this book, what should they look to get out of it? And what was your goal? Maybe not necessarily rhetorically, but usually when I write a book, I'm trying to make a point and I'm hoping people get it. What would
my goal is for people to locate themselves in the rhythm of history. And I think in so doing, one of the things that you see around us, there's such an epidemic of loneliness and isolation out there. It's just palpable. Angus Deaton talks about deaths of despair, among midlife people, among Xers, but also millennials who feel out dangling at the end of history. No one cares about their generation. No one really cares about their future living standard. No one cares about the world they're going to inhabit. And I think one of the problems is that we feel, at least part of the problem is is that because we have, and I talk about this earlier about different ways we look at time, right? And we look at time very linearly, like, time started and we're progressing.
Yeah.
Technology is changing everything, and social mores are changing, and we may be getting, most of the time we think we're getting better every year, although in a bad mood, I think we think we're getting worse every year. But whichever it is, it's going to be utterly unlike my parents, and my kids' world is going to be utterly unlike mine. So what do I have to share with them? What do we have in common? We have nothing in common. We're like alien to each other. I'm disconnected. I'm not only disconnected from, spatially, geographically from a national community, but I'm also disconnected in time from my own parents, my own kids. And one thing I wanted to do is connect people with the fact that what they are going through in terms of their generational experience, right, is connected with other people who've been through it before. There is a broader rhythm of a broader social rhythm and a changing pattern of moods that allow us to locate ourselves, that locate others who have been through what we are going through today. One thing I think of is very clear is how much the social mood that we have been in, the last 10 years or so, last 10 or 15 years, with what America went through in the 1930s. I mean, they're just such gaping similar. I mean, both of these eras started with a massive global crash, right? The GFC, or the great crash of October 1929. And they both were, brought about this huge shrinking of global trade. The peak of global trade as a share of global product recently was 2007. We've been going down ever since, and particularly the pandemic, and then with the sanctions on the Ukraine war, it's been going down further. But the same thing happened after 1929, particularly Smoot-Hawley tariff, and the entire global trade went down. So globalization went into remission. Authoritarian populism around the world. I mean, all these governments were being taken over by dictatorships in the 1930s. Same thing today. You look at the peak of the share of the world population that was free, according to VDEM or Freedom House, that was back in 2007. It's been declining ever since. And we're seeing it in Latin America, we're seeing it in Southern Europe, we're seeing it in India and Burma and China and Philippines. I mean, you just go around the world, we see this happening. And that's not all. We see extreme experimentation in public policy. That's what the New Deal was all about. That's what we've been about, right, over the past. I mean, during the pandemic, the government found ways to just keep the entire economy and every household on life support through massive fiscal and monetary policies. And all these new agencies. I mean, it sounded like FDR, all those alphabet soup of agencies. And most of all, these two periods were characterized by extreme polarization politically and an enormous increase in voter participation. After 2016, the Clinton versus Trump election, voter participation rates went up more than they had been in a century, right? And it was very much like what happened with FDR and the New Deal. You basically had two Americas. You were in favor of FDR, or you were opposed to him, and you might have called him, Franklin Stalino Roosevelt. He was that man, right? So for conservatives during the 1930s, it was the red decade. For the popular French supporters of FDR, it was the fascist decade. I mean, think of that. There was no middle way. Liberal democracy was dead. I mean, no one thought it would survive, the Great Depression. Capitalism was dead. We either went fascist or communist. Very similar to today. In fact, we see opinion polls showing that most Americans and the rising generation worldwide, especially in high-income economies around the world, are giving up faith in democracy. And we have a lot of opinion. As you know, we go through the opinion polls in the book, and we talk about that. Millennials are giving up on it because they think democracy is a betocracy. It's just older people talking about stuff all the time and finding out to never have any change. And as a result, old people get to keep what they want. And millennials are basically shut out.
Yeah, people want change, or people hate change, but they want improvement, but they're one and the same in a way. I mean, if we're going to improve, we have to change.
They want improvement, but never at their own cost. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
So, that's the problem. And that's because we're no longer a community. So in this long cycle, what happens during the awakening, most recently during the 1960s and 70s, people decide they don't want to be part of a national community so much anymore. They don't like all that social discipline. They don't like all that conformity. They don't want to follow rules. And so, we don't like the patriarchy. We don't like cultural norms. And then ultimately, we don't like taxes. We don't like regulations. I mean, think of everything that came out during that period. First, mostly on the left with, rebellion against cultural norms. And then finally on the right with the tax cuts and the deregulation. But however you look at it, America just didn't want to have to sacrifice anything for the group anymore. That's basically it. And boomers loved this new kind of world. They were perfectly comfortable in a world in which the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, so long as everyone could just do their own thing. And they created a world like that. And the thing that boomers hated most about their world that they grew up in as kids is that the middle class was so big.
Yeah.
And so conformist. Every day was Pleasant Valley Sunday. You know what I mean? Everyone had to fit into one definition. You talk to millennials today, they're like, middle class? That sounds great. Where do I sign up? Well, there is no middle class. But this is how it works. During an awakening, society supplies too much order. And society no longer wants it. The demand for it is declining. And that gives rise to all of the conflict of that era. During the fourth turning, there's also conflict. It's very different. Society no longer supplies any order, but people begin to want it again. And again, mostly the rising generation. It's almost the opposite of what was happening in the late 60s and 70s. Millennials want an ordered world again. They want corporations that can actually guarantee jobs and guarantee stuff because they have no
want security. Yeah, they're searching for security.
Risk averse, the same way that that boomers were risk prone.
Yeah.
And you see it in every aspect of their lives as they've grown older. And I think, so as you're looking at underlying dynamics, boomers back then could not stand their parents personally. They didn't want to live with them. And as soon as they could, they moved out. They had, shouting matches.
They hated their folks.
It was terrible. And in fact, in the 1970s, experienced the single fastest decline in the average number of people living together in a household. I mean, boomers are leaving early. Seniors are like setting up their own age-restricted communities in Arizona, Leisure World, and they didn't want boomers anywhere near them. Stones, Beatles, stuff.
All that stuff. Yeah.
That was the celebration of self was just anathema to the senior citizens who were beginning to retire. And meanwhile, the silent generation, they were all divorcing. That was a huge divorce decade. So everyone is splitting up. Households are getting smaller. Guess what's happened over the last decade? Households are getting larger. Everyone's living together again. I mean, millennials are coming home. People in their 20s, even 30s are living in so there's a huge demand for these large houses. Here's another parallel with the 30s. I'm sure that we've all recalled those Frank Capra movies. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. You can't take it with you. They're wonderful movies to watch, right? New Deal America during the mid 30s, late 30s. There were these big Victorian homes with a lot of different generations living together, right? Well, we weren't building any new houses in the 30s. It was the Great Depression, right? So people had to live together. In fact, the last time we had such a high rate of people in their late 20s, early 30s living with their parents before today was 1940, at the end of the last Great Depression, right? So again, back in the 1930s, we had young people who believed in community, right? They too wanted things like Social Security. I mean, they wanted a more secure world. I think we have the same kind of generation today. And And that generation turned out to be very good at doing things in groups. They they got together, about 12 million of them, and conquered half the world, as you recall, in the early 1940s. I think we have a generation like that again today. And it is interesting, even during the pandemic, right? When older people were raging against face masks, I don't want a vaccine, and it was younger people who were saying, I think we got to follow the rules.
That is interesting that the younger people would.
Think about if we had had a pandemic back in the 1970s. It would have been the older GI generations. I think we all have put on our uniforms, and you know what I mean, right? It would have been Westmoreland's generation. I think we all like to have ID cards.
Would have been flipped. Yeah.
And it would have been boomers saying, right?
Yeah, for sure.
This is why it's important to look at generational differences, because different generations don't act the same way at the same phase of life.
Let's talk about the future for a minute in a couple of ways. As I was listening to you, I had a couple of thoughts. First of all, economically, we're going to see some big change. And the reason books like yours become, really important and really popular, frankly, is people, they want to have some stability, and they do not like unknowns. They do not like the idea of an unknown future. They want to have something. Here's the plan. It's going to go through. They don't like the uncertainty of it. And there are some differences also between now and the 30s. For example, in the 30s, it wouldn't have been uncommon for most Americans to get up in the morning and go out in their garden and pick their dinner to get ready for lunch and dinner. You have economic problems now. No one has a garden. No one does. There's differences there. When FDR comes out the New Deal, we haven't been a country long enough to establish a lot of entitlement programs, right? We felt like we had room to do that. Today, it's a totally 100% different.
I absolutely agree with you here, and I think that's actually one of the more disturbing differences.
Yes.
So I'll tell you what. Let me finish your thought on that, because I think you've stumbled upon something I think about all the time.
Yeah.
In the 1930s, when the New Deal sort of had this new activism for government, and then finally we went to war. We started out with a federal government that was tiny. I mean, it was tiny. It was smaller than some large corporations, right?
It was Jeffersonian. It was Jeffersonian because no one wanted big government. We didn't want the crown. We didn't want England. It was an individual freedom deal, right?
And we were willing actually to relegate a lot of that to big corporations. Right? They would organize all this stuff, and
pensions.
We were beginning to have pensions. We had World War I pensions. Actually, we had some demonstrations around that, as I recall, in 1932.
Yeah.
But the difference is, and that's why I think today will be to some extent more conflict, and certainly more problems with the economy, is that today, to get a lot of new resources from the public sector, we have to tear down at the same time we build up. And I talk about that in the book. The biggest reason why government is starved for funding, and I've written about this. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and I've written about, my first book was with Pete Peterson, and it was on the aging of the federal budget, basically. After the Vietnam War, all the Vietnam peace dividend went to seniors, right? We invented Medicaid, we invented Medicare, we had indexing for Social Security for a while, we had double indexing. So you have this budget which is dominated. Here's the paradox of the federal budget today. It is very large, but almost none of it is spent according to any public purpose. It's just a bunch of private entitlements. So in other words,
like 2/3.
Your tax revenue all goes there, and it's your FICA and your income tax and everything, and it all gets paid back to personal entitlees.
That's exactly right.
All the creditors get paid, all the people who are lending to the federal government, right? And then most of the rest all goes to Social Security beneficiaries, Medicare beneficiaries, SSI beneficiaries. You just go down the beneficiaries.
Income. There's a new one called.
But it's my personal deal with government. It's not like I feel that we're doing anything together. And then this tiny
Yeah.
little extra left over is what we call discretionary spending. And that's actually civic spending that we all decide as a nation to spend together. And it's the thing that everyone regards as
Tiny.
dispensable. And every time the politicians want to throttle federal spending, it's always on this little thing that's called discretionary. And the very name we give it, Andy, discretionary, meaning we don't.
It's an oxymoron. Well, you use a term in your book that it struck me anyway, is you said people, like, if you want to talk about the future of boomers and Xers, boomers are really getting older now. You used a term saying, because of the pressure on all of these programs, you use the term grandfathered out. Could you expand on that a little bit? Because that is the elephant in the room that both Democrats and Republicans can't talk about, is our unfunded liabilities as we move forward in this diagonal, graph that you've described. The burden of that portion of the budget grows in a massive way to where it becomes unsustainable.
So inevitably, a lot of it will, people who are already on benefits, they've already quit their job and so on. Inevitably, when we do need to, there will come a time in the very near future, I think before the early 2030s. So really
within a decade, right? Within a decade.
Where we will suddenly require lots of resources. Government will require it. They will commandeer it. They will engage in financial repression. They will inflate their way. We can go through the various methods the government will get their resources. But at the same time, they will have to throttle down on all their current spending to all of these personal entitlements. In the process, inevitably, they will want to hold harmless those who truly are dependent. People have already retired. They have no other source of living. No one wants to take away their income. And that's what I call grandfather out. And so, in other words, if you're old enough, particularly if you've already retired, no one's going to hugely, in other words, the younger people will be cut much before them. This is why I think the real burden is going to fall on Gen X. You probably read that part of it since you are very Gen X oriented. I think a lot of the boomers will be grandfathered. I think boomers will be in penury as well. And I think that it's going to be healthcare that's going to be really affecting boomers.
That's the one.
Healthcare is by far, don't even get me started on healthcare. This is a sector that has negative productivity. We've actually had declining life expectancy since 2014, and yet we spend more every year. We could have an entire episode here just on the maladies of healthcare. But the point is that all this stuff will be throttled back, and in the process, it will by actually getting rid of the sclerotic dysfunction of our existing institutions, what I call creative destruction, in the coming first turning, which millennials will then enjoy as really, having kids and finding, doing all that, raising their kids. They will be able to have, hopefully, a renaissance, a golden age, a time when they can refashion an economy that really works. And this is why fourth turnings, even though we fear them, because they involve conflict and they involve tearing down institutions to build new ones. No one likes that, right? No one likes change. Nonetheless, they provide a new world for the young and for the future. They are a way of rejuvenating our institutions. And every time we go through these great crises, we rejuvenate America's institutions and set a wonderful floor for the generations following, just as we did after World War II.
It reminds me of the forest fire a long time ago in Yellowstone. Everyone was like, "Oh, this is horrible. This is all getting burned away." But it doesn't take too long for that new growth, and it's a beautiful, natural thing to happen.
Need fires.
Yeah,
rivers need floods. This is part of nature, and there is a part of the book, as you know, where I talk about the cycle, the saculum, these four seasons.
We should define that jargon. Let me interrupt you there. We should define that jargon because I think many people might not be familiar with the saculum. It's a lifetime, right? It's 80 years.
Yeah, it's a Latin word, and saculum, and it may have come from Etruscan. We don't know where it comes from, but it basically means a long human lifetime. And it's the word that Bill and I use to talk about these four seasons, this four generational
20
seasons.
years. Yeah. The 20 years.
Four seasons of about 20 to 25 years, right? So you have this natural unit of history. And actually it was used as a natural unit of history by the Etruscans. And we kind of covered the history of that, but it is a complex social system, and it forces us to go through episodes that we might not voluntarily want to go through. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Just like no one wants a forest fire, no one wants a flood, but it's necessary. And I do think that if you want to talk about the economy of this coming time, because I think there aren't some things we can say about it. One of them is just some basic ground rules, right? One of them is that inflation is always a way that the public sector recoups its debts during fourth turning. It's happened every fourth turning. Right?
Yeah.
So nominally fixed income assets are truly get punished. And I tell people that. I mean, so this means that bonds, particularly long-term bonds, and the government engages in financial repression, so they don't allow you to sell the bond. You have to sort of eat the losses. You can no longer trade them, and we saw this, back in the
it's a wealth killer
and early 1950s coming out of the World War II. So we inflate our way out of the debt, and that means that the bondholders are punished. I also think there are a number of other things we can say. Volatility will be extreme. I mean, think of the volatility of the 30s. I often ask people, what was the second worst recession of the 20th century? They sort of think about that. Not sure what it was. And they say 1937. Almost no one thinks about that. 1937 was horrible. The stock market went down by 50%.
It was.
We were back in the Great Depression again. And excuse me. But the volatility of fourth turnings is terrifying. And so you want genuine, not just on paper, you want genuine diversification. You can't just expect that, I'm going to be in different, style classes and so on within the U.S. economy, because every time a crisis hits, all the correlations go to one, right? Everything goes down together. So
the systemic stuff hurts.
Geographic, you need commodities. And let me say this one last thing, and that is, because we're going to be remaking the outer world, and that's so important. Commodities, what we call in the S&P, materials, the kind of the material sector, as well as the manufacturing sectors, become more important. Now, these are very unsexy sectors. I mean, if you look at material, you talk to anyone about S&P, the materials, and they always think, oh, these are these, what? They I don't know, they sit through sand, they got some kind of, element. These become really important, right, along with commodities. And you think about in the 1930s, how the entire world was searching for oil, and the entire world begins to be cut up into these different zones. I mean, not only is there less global trade, but Japan had its co-prosperity sphere, and it eventually went to war because it was looking for oil, right? It had to send its ships to the Philippines, and it said we're going to have a war in the United States. In any case, our ships have been going through the Philippines. Let's strike them at Pearl Harbor first. I mean, that was essentially their logic. But my point is, commodities will become important. Energy is going to become more important, and particularly so because of the way we careened off zero carbon, and it's going to create more of an issue there. And I also think that you need to look very carefully around the world at the possibility that you might not get your assets back. So to the extent, investing globally is great because it's diversifying. On the other hand, you do want to make sure that we are diversifying in, because
it's tough, because if you in difficult times, we tend to go from social to primal, and it's very difficult to defend your turf in a primal environment. But there's two things I think readers will gain from your book. And I don't want to ruin it for people because they might get things that are even better than these two. But I think there's two solid. The reason I would advocate people going to Amazon.com and spending some quality time in studying what your work's been about is I think there's two real big benefits. In my life, I'm an overgrown boy. I'm 6'8", so I'm literally an overgrown Boy Scout. Okay, and luckily, I went through the Boy Scouts without any problems. For me, it was a wonderful experience. I didn't have any of this problems. People, there's no Me Too movement here with me in a Boy Scouts. But their mottos: be prepared. And while you can try to predict, the thing I've learned about predicting is we kind of know it's going to change, but it's a little bit harder to know where we're going to land. Usually you say, look, this is going to change, and it does, but how it changes is often a surprise. But there are principles people can embrace in terms of preparation. And if someone reads your book, they can look and they say, okay, what can I do to help myself and help my family in this transition, right? How do I get to the spring and how to do that? So I think there's some inspiration for vigilance, new actions, new plans, new thought. Don't get so involved in your life that you don't step back and look at the big picture of what I can accomplish. I think your book absolutely wakes people up to ask introspective questions about, what is going to happen and what powers can I do? There's the things that are coming upon me, but what can I also do to influence my own life? Like, I want a sense of control, and I think this book inspires people to want to, get as much control as they can. But I think an even bigger one, I'm a big fan of some of Chris Martinson's work. And I was in a meeting with him, and he said something so profound. We had about probably 60 or 70 pretty high-end investors in there. And someone asked the question, you mentioned diversification in assets. And someone said, when you have a crash and a tragedy, what's the best asset class? And Chris said something I've never forgot. He said, your greatest asset is going to be your community. It's going to be the people that are around you. I'm a classic Xer. I don't know if I'm a helicopter parent, probably, and don't know. A fish doesn't know it's in water. But I always tell my sons, I go, your greatest asset when things go south is groups of people that are communities, 100 people, 50 people, and even in your family, 5 or 6 in your extended family. And I think you see that in the 30s where they bonded together. Yeah. And I think family, sons, daughters, brothers, sisters, family is an asset that people throw away at their peril and at the loss of happiness.
We started talking about that, actually, when I started talking about this revival in extended family living in America, right? We already see that happen. And for a lot of boomers and Xers who grew up in an America that seemed to be going into a mode of living solo, everyone is sort of, you're just on your own. Each person is sort of a market nexus. You just go out and hire yourself out, live wherever you want, travel around the world, wherever you want to go. You know what I mean? And I think this is the world in which Xers came of age in. I mean, I could work in Estonia, and tomorrow I could be in London, and I could just go wherever I want to go. I'd have my laptop, and I just, I could plug into the markets every day. That's really great, and that was sort of the leitmotif of the 1990s. You remember with Francis Fukuyama and the end of history. Markets were triumphant. Individualism was triumphant. Government was just going to wither away. And we were all just going to be this global marketplace of individuals. All the great struggles of history had disappeared. This was at the time of the .com, right?
Yeah.
And I think that boomers and Xers, I think millennials know that's ridiculous, absurd, right? I mean, millennials never really believed in that, but I think a lot of boomers and Xers believed in that future. And I think you're absolutely right. The big lesson at Fourth Turnings is, above all, when all the official entitlements are being cut back, right? All that stuff that allowed you to be an individual is being cut back. It's your family and your community. Time and again, people ask me, how can I get, long-term care insurance? As you know, long-term care insurance is it's moral hazard. It's not affordable. It's very difficult, to purchase. And I said the only good long-term care insurance is being on good terms with your family. I mean, you know what I mean? I mean, that is your long-term care insurance. And you really need to think about that. I mean, you could spend tens of thousands of dollars a year trying to buy it.
But that's not
get it.
That's not just a fiscal thing, though. And I'll tell you why. Like, I've been very fortunate in my life. You talked about, there's a divide in Generation Xers, and there's quite a divide economically in my generation. And certainly where, someone, maybe they write a check. Well, I'll tell you, my wife was diagnosed with cancer 18 months ago, and there's no amount of money in the world that can provide the emotional care and the support that needs to be needed, like her two sons have given her. You can't buy that. You can be rich and have all the gold in the world, but gold doesn't love you back. And so while I really believe in being fine, I mean, the Cash Flow Academy, our whole purpose is to elevate the well-being of humankind, financially, the financial well-being, because you need money to eat and you need money to have freedom and do what you want to do. But aside from that, I think as I've grown older, the ideals of kindness and familial bond, the happiness that is available in whatever circumstances you find you're in. If you can sit around the fire table and get enough money for a marshmallow and your kids, it's pretty good stuff. Relationships are great investments. So I think those are the two things. If you can read that book, you'll be heightened and inspired to prepare, financially and professionally and as an investor. But you'll also realize the importance, like you said, we're lonely, and there's deaths that are happening because of this loneliness.
Yes, and,
I'll give you the last word. As we close.
I again, there's a part in the book where we talk about the social transformations of a fourth turning, and I think when people think about this, from the late 90s or early O's just before the GFC to the mid 2030s or late 2030s, we will see a transformation in America and much of the world, but particularly America, which will be very similar to how America transformed from the roaring 20s to the early 1950s. Think of that, right? Think of that, from individualism, often extreme and bizarre individualism in the late 1920s, there's kind of a zany kind of market frenzy going on, and people, there was a the lost generation is coming of age as rum runners and barnstormers and the gin fizz crowd. And it was kind of a wild culture. Think of where we were by the early 50s, right? And think about America traversing that path, because we've seen it again and again, these fourth turnings. But think about this. It's going to go from individualism to community. It's going to go from privilege to equality. That's another thing that's going to change. It's going to go from defiance to authority. Large social structures will have more authority. I mean, think of the 1950s, when everyone kind of just fit in, I mean, there was the suburbs, and the experts said stuff in their white coats, and everyone actually did what the experts said. I mean, we think of the American high, that's what it was. So we're going from defiance to authority. We're going from deferral to permanence. People will actually build permanent things, large infrastructures. We'll actually invest in the future again. We might run budget surpluses again. This is another lesson coming out of fourth turnings. And finally, the culture will go from irony to convention. And I talk about all of those things in the book, how it's happened before and how it's likely to happen again.
Well, we've been speaking with Neil Howe. He is the author of, The Fourth Turning is Here. Pick it up at Amazon.com and go to his website, thefourthturning.com. And the most important thing I would say as an education advocate is make this part of your library. The more you can learn, the more you can glean from people who've worked really hard on their research. You'll make your own decisions, but I think you'll come away from the reading of this book with an inspiration for preparation to find out where you fit, some introspection. I think it's a wonderful work, and it's a broad. Oh my goodness, the amount of observation geographically, obviously generationally, politically, it is quite a landscape that you observe, both in time and space. It's a heck of a book. So we thank you for writing it, and we thank you for being with us. You've been listening and now watching the Cashflow Academy podcast. This is where we do our best to make things simple as possible. I'm Andy Tanner. I again thank my guest, Neil Howe. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the Cashflow Academy podcast with Andy Tanner. For more information on investing made easy, go to thecashflowacademy.com.